All right, we're recording.
Amazing, thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. You all know me, I'm Kevin Arms. I'm the Dean of Communications here at Lake Sumter State College. In addition, I also teach literature and composition, and much of my work, both in the classroom and, as you guys probably know, with faculty across multiple disciplines, really focuses on a single question. How do students move from experience to interpretation? So I want to begin with something very, very small, a sentence we have all read, a sentence we probably read even yesterday. This story was scary. I really liked this character. And then there's one we hear everywhere, and not just in literature, right? This makes no sense. These are not weak responses, though. They are unfinished responses. So what they are is evidence that something happened between a student and an idea, something emotional, something cognitive, something interpretive. So today I want to explore how we help students stay in that moment just a little bit longer and how we can help them follow reaction into reflection. Students often believe that analytical thinking requires emotional distance. They imagine that the ideal thinker is neutral, detached, almost mechanical. But strong thinkers aren't mechanical. They're alert, they're responsive, they're affected. They feel tension and confusion and friction, curiosity, awe. The issue isn't that students feel too much. The issue is that they stop feeling too early. They name the reaction and then they abandon the investigation. This is confusing. This feels uncomfortable. This doesn't make sense. But what if we treated those moments as beginnings instead of a breakdown? Our work is to help students stay with the disturbance long enough to ask much better questions. Why did this moment disrupt? What specifically changed? Where did my understanding falter? What's the text, the problem, or the system asking me to reconsider? When students learn to examine reaction instead of trying to escape from it, something magical happens. Emotion becomes information. Information becomes interpretation, and an interpretation becomes an argument. To see how this shift happens in real time, we need a lens. Not a theory we're going to memorize, but it's a way of seeing. In the 18th century, Edmund Burke gave us one of the most powerful of these types of lenses. He called it the sublime. The sublime is not comfort. It's not beauty. It's not simple pleasure. It's the emotional intensity we feel when we encounter something vast or overwhelming or uncertain. Darkness, power, obscurity, loss of control, the sense that we are near something we do not fully understand. Burke argued that we experience the sublime most strongly when we're close enough to danger to feel it, but still safe enough to continue. Literature is uniquely capable of creating this condition. Writers bring us to the edge of fear, the edge of chaos, the edge of the unknown, and then they hold us there. So when a student says, "This scene was terrifying," that is not the end of the interpretation. That is the signal that interpretation is about to begin. Once we introduce a lens like the sublime, students begin to realize something crucial. Their reactions are not accidental. They're crafted, they're shaped, they're engineered. And once students understand that text can shape their emotional experience, they also begin to recognize that ideas, systems, environments, and arguments do the same thing. This is the beginning of the guided vision. I'm going to read a short passage from Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum. As I read, resist analyzing this. Note your reactions instead. I had scarcely stepped into the room, slow, leaning slightly, when I became aware of the smell of mold and decay. The wall seemed at once to recede from me. I stretched out my arms and shuddered to find that I was surrounded by nothing but darkness. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. Suddenly, my chin struck upon some yielding substance. I fell prostrate, my face touching the damp and slimy floor of the dungeon. What did you feel? Feel free to unmute yourself. What did that hearing that passage, what did you feel? Okay, this is where students begin, the reaction to the reading. What created that feeling? So we're going to slow the moment down for a second and we're going to look at it. We're going to look at the architecture of the feeling and how that transponds to interpretation. So first, we're going to talk about darkness. Not just description, but disorientation, the removal of any spatial certainty. The reader cannot see. The narrator cannot see, so you don't have control. Then it's pacing. Notice how movement becomes abrupt. Sentences shorten, breath tightens. Suddenly my chin struck. Shock enters the experience. Then texture. Fear is no longer abstract. It becomes physical, immediate, and visceral. Damp and slimy. Now the reader is not observing terror, the reader is inside of it. Finally, obscurity. Burke tells us that uncertainty intensifies emotional response. We do not know where the narrator is. We do not know what will happen. We do not know how to escape. This is the mechanics of the sublime. And now, and only now, can we translate that reaction into analysis. This was scary becomes something else. Instead, it becomes Poe creates a sublime atmosphere of terror through sensory deprivation, disrupted pacing, and tactile imagery that traps the reader within the narrator's psychological and physical experience. That's the intellectual part, right? Students realize that meaning is not only found in what a text says, but in what it does to them. What we have just done with Poe is not limited to literature, however. Students experience powerful reactions in every discipline area. In mathematics, students may not describe terror, but they do describe confusion, intimidation, or cognitive overload. When a student says, "This problem makes no sense," they're standing at the edge of an intellectual threshold. Our role isn't to remove the threshold. Our role is to help them understand what actually created it. So then we can ask, what step caused that confusion? What representation changed? What assumption was challenged? Now the student is analyzing thinking itself, stepping back from content to look at the process, the assumptions, the strategy. We call this metacognition, and it is one of the foundational habits of mind that supports transfer of learning across curriculums, persistence in complex problem solving, and it does lead to lifelong intellectual adaptability. In science, students often say the result is surprising. Surprise? That signals the prior mental model being disrupted. That's where conceptual growth occurs. In technical or applied disciplines, students may say the system is frustrating. Frustration then becomes the starting point for analyzing usage ability, design logics, and workflow efficiency. Across disciplines, reaction becomes the doorway to better understanding. When we provide an interpretive lens, whether that's the sublime in literature or conceptual modeling in mathematics, experimental reasoning in science, or systems thinking in applied fields, we're teaching students how to see structure beneath experience. We're not telling students what to think. We're teaching them how to see. And guided vision is transferable. It prepares students to interpret texts, data, environment, arguments, and systems throughout the rest of their lives. So this is my practical scaffolding that I use in my class. And we've heard that word a lot today, actually. I've heard it in most of the sessions I've attended, where there's been strong leaning into the idea of scaffolding assignments and approaches. I actually have found, without even realizing it, I was modeling the same approach. So I have built essentially a pathway to help students analyze their thinking. So we start with the reaction, and I have them write one honest reaction to the passage. For example, the same one that I read earlier from The Pit and the Pendulum. And then I have them pinpoint the exact moment that they had a reaction and what was it. And then we're going to look at it through the lens. And I often use I write this on the board, a fill in the blank situation. So I gave some examples here. The author creates the feeling of blank by using blank. Or this concept is difficult because blank. Or the result is surprising because of blank. Those are your doorways into deeper understanding. So I want to double back and talk about how do students move from experience to actual interpretation? Not by avoiding reaction, I can say that, but they do have to learn how to actually stay with it, to examine it, to question it, to translate it. Students don't need really fewer emotional or cognitive responses. They need better interpretive tools. When we help students move forward from reaction to reflection, we're not only helping them write better essays or solve harder problems, we're helping them become more aware of how meaning is constructed, how arguments actually persuade, or how systems influence behavior, or how environments shape perception. This is bigger than any single assignment. It's about building a mind habit, metacognition, intellectual persistence, and analytical courage. Across institutions, we often talk about student success in terms of completion, retention, workforce readiness, but underneath all of those goals, there's a quieter one. Can students learn to make sense of complexity? Can they remain steady in moments of uncertainty? Can they move from feeling overwhelmed to asking better questions? And this is the work of guided vision, and it is deeply transferable. A student who learns to analyze fear in Poe can learn to analyze abstraction in mathematics. A student who learns to examine surprise in science can learn to evaluate evidence in civic life. A student who learns to integrate and interrogate frustration in a technical system can learn how to redesign that system. When we teach students to follow their reactions into reflection, we're teaching them how to learn, but not just in our classrooms, but throughout the rest of their lives. Because the ultimate goal is not simply analytical writing, it's actually analytical awareness. Thank you. I would open for any questions you may have about my talks. Audrey, I see you have your hand raised. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi.
I was just curious because you were bringing up the sublime more specifically. Yes. Do you also talk to the students kind of about the, not necessarily the opposite, but the different perspective of sort of like the Romanticism idea of the beautiful as well? And
so let me explain how my course is kind of set up at the moment. So I'm looking at fear across contexts. So we start with the sublime as the initial discussion of how they identified what fear was in literature, or what it is in general. He was an aestheticist. And he recognized that it was different than the idea of beauty. And so he gave us this concept of awe. And I took that idea and I kind of pulled it across all of the literary periods. So we start off by talking in Romanticism about how the fear is external. We talk about fear being supernatural elements or man versus nature or whatever, in that scenario. And we start to move into different time periods. And as we move through our contexts, we shift our perspective of what's causing the fear and what it says about the greater societal influences that are happening during that time. And so my course is set up in units. We do Romanticism, I do Realism and Naturalism. We do modernity, and we do Harlem Renaissance, and then we move into contemporary literature. And I've picked and chosen specific things from each of those areas, and they're not all, like when I say fear, fear comes in so many forms. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about fear in the sense of something supernatural. Fear can be internal. And so, for example, I use Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. Maybe not some people's favorite novel to read, but it's an internal fear. And it really does represent the time period from which that story was written. We also look at Turn of the Screw by Henry James. That's more of a horror story or ghost story, but it's also not. And we had in class a really rigorous discussion starting with their confusion because the narrator is unreliable. And it opened a door because they said to me, well, I don't know exactly who is referring to this. And I said, well, let's stay with that. let's dive in and let's see where that goes. And they suddenly realized, well, the narrator is kind of nuts. And I'm like, well, that is an interpretation. And can you point to examples of it in the story that support that? And we move through different things. I'm using not necessarily contemporary, but it still is sort of contemporary in a sense. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness is the story that I'm using as our capstone text this semester. And we're spreading it out over an entire unit, and we're doing a deep dive into each section to look at various elements of fear and how it translates into the contemporary era.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Other questions? Please jump in. I realize that was kind of short, and I just don't want to PowerPoint people to death. This is a really great lens, and I think it has a lot of application, not just to literature, but to everything. And I discovered this through my own personal experiences, to be honest with you. I had issues with panic, like panic disorder stuff. And it got me thinking about like fear and fear as a concept and what makes people scared. And it really kind of, I started doing my own research and I discovered Edmund Burke. And while I had, kind of passed through him in grad school at one point, like I never paid much attention to him. And I thought this is a really interesting way to look at literature across time and have a common place to have a discussion with students, because they understand, vastness and obscurity and darkness. Those things make sense to them, even in the early literature, and they now see how that appears today. I've had some very visceral reactions to emotional works that they've read so far this semester, things I was very surprised by. They took a lot of emotional energy from D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winter. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that story, but in that story, the character, they were pitted together. There were two stories there that I used that were very different. I think I also used Virginia Woolf's A Haunted House, which is Stream of Consciousness. And they had a very serious reaction to the emotional neglect in the story involving the mother and the child. And we had I was surprised by this, but we had an entire hours-long discussion effectively about how that happens and what does that say about society. And it was fascinating. They teach me as much as they learn from us, I assume. Because they always find a new emotional entry point that I don't really know. That's what I love about literature, though, is that meaning is interpreted as reading. And so, questions, thoughts, concerns, confusion? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, not a question, but a comment. I had
Sure.
recently read, it's a very short book called Post-Truth by Lee McIntyre, and kind of talked about, the way in which a lot of people now are sort of emotionally driven by what they believe to be true and false. And I just feel as though this approach to literature that you're describing is maybe something that would be important to say, that we value our emotional reactions, but then we
Yes.
can also train ourselves to go back to the text and think about why do we feel that way, as opposed to just saying, this is the feeling that I have, and so this is what must be true for me.
Yes.
So I just thought, like, I don't know why it's, I I care about how my students feel, but I don't think when I'm teaching lit that I think to ask them, how does this make you feel? Because I want the underlying analysis. I want you to tell me what you think it means, as opposed to like what you feel. So I appreciate this perspective, and I think this is a tool that I might use. So thanks.
I have found great success with this. I will just say, I have found students at this stage in the semester, they have definitely engaged. I have a scaffold system where every week they write a reflection that starts with how did you feel about this piece? What jumped out at you? And then we have unit essays where I have them take those experiences and then turn them into actual arguments, so to speak, about why the literature shows that this is the case and how the author did it in terms of mechanics. And so I've discovered they are looking at things like short sentences and pacing and structure on the page. And I'm surprised by the depth of the responses I've gotten in some of the unit essays. They've actually been quite good. They have really thought a lot about those elements. And I think that connecting to that emotional reaction, that first read emotional reaction, has been very powerful for them. And so I'm already kind of brainstorming ways to incorporate that later into other elements, because I think that's that's a teachable entry for us. That's a great place to start students into the realm of metacognition and analytical thinking, and not taking everything at face value. And I think that's important. We don't want to prescribe how people think, but we do want them to be encouraged to explore ideas beyond their own. And I think literature does that, and interpretive literature does that as well. So I find that this has been very effectual for my class so far. it's early in my research time period with this approach, but it does seem to be generating some deep discussion.
That's great. I hope that it's transferable into other
I hope so.
contexts
Yeah.
as well.
I would love to hear if you decide to use elements of it. I'd like to hear about your response with your students. Feel free to email me and share that with me. I am always interested how people translate something like this, or how did you make it work for your circumstance? Because I think it is a universal. I do think it applies to every field. If we think about how people react in circumstances, we often dismiss that stuff. We'll say, oh, well, not when I say we, I don't mean we, I mean society. Society dismisses the emotional connection in modern life to things. And I think we need to stop and go back to that, because it's really important. You need to be able to connect why something feels weird to you to actual reasoning. And I find that students have said that it's gotten them thinking about things outside of class. And I was like, well, that's great. Like that's more than I could have hoped for. I wanted you to kind of analyze literature, but if you are analyzing other circumstances and you're able to say, well, this is why it made me feel that way, I think that's valid. That's, even if I can do that with one student, I think that was valuable. So they had very powerful reactions as an entire class to the Harlem Renaissance. And it was profound. We had a very deep discussion about contemporary society and society at that time, and how those parallels still exist. And it's very interesting to me what they pick up on and what they connect to. In previous classes, I started by asking students questions like, which reading was the most meaningful to you? And I was always surprised by the response. In 1102, for a long time, we were teaching a variety of different short stories, and I have an Ernest Hemingway story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, that was in there. And I personally loathe Ernest Hemingway, and I know that probably just said something terrible. But I can't believe the students actually named that as their favorite reading of the entire semester. This was a class of 24, and they all said they liked that one the best. And I'm like, how does your generation, because these are much younger students, how does your generation relate to that story? And the answer was loneliness. And so I was very surprised by that response. And that's kind of what got my mind ticking to, like, how can I get them to go deeper than just, I liked this. It's the same thing with peer review, right? We see this when we're doing, and I know it's why many of us just get so aggravated with things like discussion boards and stuff, because they'll say something like, well, I really liked this argument. Okay. What else? What did you like about it? Why do you think the author why did that make it feel that way to you? Was it effective? They don't take that next step. And I think we'd all gotten frustrated with the discussion post responses. And I know I had, because, I teach literature and composition, and they will just phone it in if they think they can get away with it. And I found myself going back constantly, asking them deeper questions. Why did you like this? What is it about this that you liked? What did you think was good? What is bad? Because I don't think they know to interrogate things. You should always do that, in my opinion. But that's my personal opinion. You should always ask questions. They don't always do that.
Yeah, I agree. They should ask more questions, frequent questions. Yeah.
Challenge authority.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Challenge established status quo. Ask a question, make people uncomfortable, and try to make them explain, like, why is this that way, or why is that way? Why does it? I think it's an important thought process, and I think a lot of students are missing that experience. And I don't know. I don't know what the cause of that is. I couldn't really say. So
I agree.
Have anything? Some of you are here and you're quiet, so feel free to hop in. Ellie, you're an English instructor. What do you think? Can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, you definitely put me on the spot.
Sorry.
I cannot. So I will say that I totally agree with you on the discussion, because I won't even do a peer review on for like essays, because
no.
they're just not at that point where they can actively give decent feedback.
Yeah. They don't know enough to give useful feedback, right? That's what we've been talking about. Yeah.
So when it comes to discussions, I definitely like I have in my on my discussion board prompts to kind of help them with their feedback so that they're not just saying, oh, I like that. I like that thesis statement, or I like, you know, what if it's a story, you know, I like how, you know, the character does this. I have them look at the options and they can choose like a prompt, like why do you like this? Like tell me, you know, give me more feedback on that. Give me details. So
Go deeper.
it helps.
Yes, go deeper.
Yeah.
And I think it's good. You do it in Comp 1, and I do it in Comp 1 also. I try to challenge them to go deeper, go the next question step, ask the next question. And they don't always do that. I mean, that's the skill progression that we're trying to teach, right? Is question, ask questions, try to understand concepts. And, you know, we teach rhetoric a lot of the times and structural composition. And I think that they should be asking questions. Argumentation is basically a question and answer session with yourself in a lot of ways. Why do you feel this way about this argument, and how can you prove it? And we should, you know, we do need the textual proof. The emotion is wonderful, but it doesn't take us any further if they can't actually pinpoint in something why they feel that way and point to examples, especially if we're talking about literature. You should be able to point to examples in the text that kind of support that. And I would say the same is true. Math is an interesting place for this because students often hit a point and they go, I'm so confused. And so the next question isn't, you know, it's not that they ask the next question, which is what is confusing about this for me? It's then they get the phobia. They're like, well, I just can't do math. And it's, you know, that I hear this in students in English too. They're just like, well, English is not my strongest point. And I'm like, are you a person that can read? Because if you can read something, you can create meaning. You know, I'm a firm believer of, you know, meaning being created in the point of reading. That's when people, and I could go into an entire discussion topic about how meaning works in terms of word usage and you know, signifiers. But ultimately, like that's the thing, is students don't ask the deeper questions, and I think we do need to make them do that. But the best way to do it is by connecting it to their emotional response. Show them something shocking and say, okay, so how do you feel about this? You know, and then why, and make them start taking those things apart. Why does it scare you? Why does it make you nervous? What, you know, it's hard to do that, and I admit this. So I think we all struggle a bit with going sometimes beyond that point of, you know, this is terrifying, and but we don't, because we're afraid of it, we don't go any further and ask, why does it scare me? And I do think we should. I think that there's immense value in thinking about thinking, you know, when it comes to this, because we build these patterns. So much of what we do is built from contextual elements, and I think it's sometimes good to question these things.
So Kevin, I have a question.
Sure.
I actually have a question for you. So I know that the idea behind this is to help them with their analytical writing. That's kind of the end goal here. But do you think that just going through this process also has kind of like a side effect of like helping with their emotional intelligence? Just because
Yes.
a lot of things that what I've experienced, you know, especially the dual enrollment side and talking to employers that of students that do dual enrollment, particularly, is that these students lack emotional intelligence. They don't know how to process emotions. And I know that although that's not the purpose of this, I feel like naturally that would happen.
It's a side effect. Yeah, I would think it's a side effect of this kind of process, because it would, like I said, we're teaching them ways to look at the world. I think it would help them evaluate their own feelings and understand, yeah, and that can't possibly be a bad thing. You know, having that emotional intelligence develop, and that's been a big discussion lately, you know, about dual enrollment. You know, the emotional intelligence required to be a college student, and, you know, are they really ready? And if they're not, how do we get them there? Like, how do we start them on that path to, I like to think of it as self-actualization. I mean, that, not to use a guru term, but that's kind of what it is. They need to be more aware of who they are and how they fit into that. And I think emotion is our doorway, right? That's the doorway into that, and that's a place we know that they have, because that's a human experience. And we can use that to open up the discussion for greater things. And along the way, they may accidentally learn some emotional mechanisms that are good for them, you know, or they may change their point of view simply because they've thought deeply enough about something. So yeah, I do. It's not the direct intended purpose, but I definitely think I've probably been influenced, no doubt, by dual enrollment students. I've taught them for several years, and I recognize that issue. And I find that's true, especially in literature, because they don't, the biggest thing that people have with it is that they think that meaning is fixed. There's only one meaning to literature. Something means something. And I'm like, that's not true. There's places to ask questions and go deeper, because every person's experience is different with something, you know, and I don't know. I do think that it helps build a bit of emotional resilience if they're able to analytically take apart feelings and find real root reasons for why. Sometimes that leads them into interesting places like, you know, cognition or neuroplasticity, you know, depending on what they're thinking about. But I no, I don't think it's a bad thing, but I definitely do think it's a side effect, even an unintended one, but I'm glad it is. So
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, of course. Anybody else? Jump in, ask me anything you want. Well, who doesn't want a few extra minutes back in their day? All right. Well, thank you all for being here with me today. I encourage that you reach out if you decide to use some of these techniques in your class. I'd be curious to hear how that goes for you. Feel free to reach out and just say, hey, I tried this, and you'll be surprised by what the students said. You know, so your mileage may vary, but I'd be very curious to hear how your experience works out for you. So, thank you guys all for being here. I appreciate you immensely. Have a great day.